Welcome to Do This to Get to That. My name is Dr. Big Black Yamon Dada. I have a little story I'd like to share with you. When I was 4 years old, my father was killed in an accident. Actually, I was 3 years old when he was killed. And his wake, he died 10 days after the accident. And they were holding a wake in the house on my 4th birthday, February 24th. And I remember standing on the staircase, looking down into the parlor of our house at my father lying in his coffin. And what was going through my mind at the time was, why was my father sleeping in this box? You know? Pops always slept in his bed. But being a young 4-year-old, I had no idea. This is the first time I had ever seen a person dead. And I didn't relate to death. I just thought he was asleep in this box. And then on the other side of the room, for which I could not see from my position on the staircase, were people talking in the background. And then there were some laughs. People were telling stories. And then out of the laugh would come these wailing cries of sadness, because my father was a well-loved man. We didn't have much, but whatever we had, we shared. You know, people would come, and in those days it was depression, a lot of bad things, 1940s. You know, World War II was going on. Anyway, after my father was put away and my mother got everything cleared away, the little money that the gas company gave my parents for my father's death, my mother used it to buy a house across the border from Savannah, Georgia, where we lived at the time, in South Carolina. She built this house, had this house built. And about 6 months later, we moved to South Carolina. And I was placed in elementary school there at age 6. This is about 2 years later. And I went to Jericho School. And my teacher was Mr. Ulysses Jenkins and Miss Nettie Carter. They taught. And we had a classroom where grades 1 through 5 was taught. And then after 5, you go into 6th grade. That was like your sophomore year, and you go to high school at 6th grade. And I was a pretty good learner. And at 8 years old, I started playing the drums. And I was self-taught. I mean, people would come to the neighborhood and I would be on the porch lying on my back banging on the floor with my hands and stomping with my feet for the bass drum. And this is how I started playing before I ever saw a drum. And then there was the old battery radio that we had. And every now and then, if you could fine tune it, you know, you had to turn those buttons and get a lot of static. Every now and then on certain nights when the wind or when the signal was in the area, you would pick up a program that came from Cuba. And this program was called Swing Casino. The guy was speaking in Spanish, but he always said something like, Alabios a las estrellas, in tune to our swing casino. And I'd be listening, and that's when I heard my first conga drum and bongo drums being played on this battery-operated radio. And I was really turned on by it, and that was my first fascination with being a hand percussionist. Because I was beating on everything. I was a natural. I would beat on a table. I would beat on the chairs. You know what I'm saying? When my mother wasn't around, I'd take one of her pots and start playing on it. And I was growing. I went to Jericho School. I was started at age 6 and started playing, banging on the drums and things from 6 to age 9. Because I remember when I was 9 years old, I think I was in the 5th grade. I was an unruly kid in school. I had a cousin named David, and he and I, we were the two most mischievous kids I can think of. We were so mischievous. They had David sitting in one corner of the classroom by himself, and I was sitting in the other corner of the classroom. And facing the rest of the students sitting at their desk. And we were forbidden to make a noise of any kind. If we did, Miss Carter would take that ruler she had and she would open my hands and hold it and whack you 5 or 6 times in your hands with that ruler. And, you know, kids, especially when you're mischievous and you don't want to shed any tears in front of the rest of the class, you toughen up. You learn to be tough. And I was tough, and David was tough. In those days, they used to oil the classroom floor. It was just a big old A-frame building, you know what I'm saying? And I think there was 2 buildings sitting side by side. Mr. Jenkins was in one building, and Miss Carter was in the other. Miss Carter was teaching grades 1 through 4, or 1 through 1. She taught 3 classes. Mr. Jenkins taught 3 classes in the other building, and they would the education department, I guess, was responsible for keeping these schools sanitized. And one of the sanitation things that they had to do was to oil the floors in the school, in the classroom, with oil. I mean, they took this black crude oil, that same kind of stuff almost that you make asphalt from, that they use in the street. They would come in and oil the floor. These guys would come in once a year, and with these big mops and these big tubs full of oil, and they would oil the floor. And when they did this, that means that the kids had to be dismissed, go out into the yard and play, or, you know, just hang out and watch through the door while they oil the floor. So when they finished oiling the floor, the kids were allowed to go back into the classroom, and we would have to assemble our desk and things back to where it was on these greasy floors. So the teacher was out of the room. Miss Carter was in the next classroom at Mr. Jenkins on this particular day that they had just oiled the floor. And after the engineers that oiled the floor had left, me and my crazy cousin David and a few of the other boys decided that we would have a chair race on the floor. Now they had these chairs that sat on a one leg. It was a one leg in the center of the chair, and it spread it out at the bottom like the mouth of a horn. A big circle made out of solid steel, and it was bolted to the bottom of the chair. These are big old thick oak chairs. And these chairs, you could swivel with these chairs. You understand how to swivel. And we were using these chairs like race cars. We would run from one end of the classroom to the other, pushing these chairs. And then when you get up to speed, you jump on the chair and get a ride till you bump against the wall, and then you do it back the other way. And that's what we were doing while the teacher was out of the room. So we are pushing the chairs, having a ball, laughing and just going nuts. And there was a nail sticking up about a quarter of an inch out of the floorboard in this room. And I was full throttle racing this chair, and that flat metal bottom hit that nail. The chair bounced over. I went forward, and my leg came right down on the edge of that steel chair and cut a gap in my legs. I have a scar to this day from that accident to the bone. And I didn't run. I jumped up and started running again. And one of the other kids looked at me and said, "Oh, Daniel, look at your leg." I had a big gap in my leg. I was bleeding. And that's when I panicked. Kid run out, called the teacher. Miss Carter came in and looked at my leg. She didn't know what to say, man. I just looked at her face. And when she saw my leg, and she immediately got some towels and stuff and wrapped it around my leg and put me in the car and drove straight to Beaufort, which was about 6 or 7 miles away, to the doctor. Now, in those days, South Carolina, even to this day, South Carolina is a very, very prejudiced place. It's much better today because they got mixed marriages and things down there now. But in those days, they were still lynching black people, you know. And I was a boy. If you did something wrong, they didn't care how old you was. They would deal with you if you did something wrong. At that time, there was a very, very bad disease that was prominent, like almost like this COVID thing, you know. People were dying from encephalitis. I'm sure that whomever is listening to this is familiar with the disease encephalitis. And there was no cure for encephalitis at the time. But a military doctor had discovered from a mole on certain fruit a antidote that he developed from this mole that would kill the syphilis bug, you might say. And I don't know whether you remember the Tuskegee, was it 4? The Tuskegee 4. There were 4 men in Tuskegee, Alabama, that had been injected with the syphilis virus so that they could be experimented on to test the new penicillin that was just made from this mole by the military to see whether it works. And they were made very sick from this virus. Now, I don't know exactly whatever happened to the Tuskegee 4, but I heard about it. At the time, I was 9 years old when this thing happened to me when I cut my leg. And my teacher took me to this doctor who was evidently associated with the military in some way to supply guinea pigs for the drug, to experiment with this drug to see whether this drug, how this drug affects human beings, how it affects your nervous system, and the best way to administer it to kill this encephalitis. I don't know for sure whether I was the first or the only, but I had never, to this day, heard of any kid being used in those experiments. But when I was 9 years old and Miss Carter took me to this doctor to stitch up my leg, this doctor introduced the encephalitis bug into my blood through that cut on my leg. And within 2 weeks, on the same leg, my thigh broke out into these huge circular whelps that would eventually become infected, because the longer you let it go, the more infected you get. Pus, all kind of nasty things start happening. And my mother was looking at me. I was going through this pain of this thing, and we didn't know what it was at the time. I'm 9 years old. About a week after that, after I broke out, we got a letter stating that I had some kind of blood disease and that I needed to be hospitalized for treatment, you know. And when my mother questioned it, they said it's called diabetic. They told my mother it was diabetes that I had. I was a healthy kid, man. And nobody in my family, nobody in my village where I lived had ever suffered anything like this. And I didn't know at the time that this doctor had introduced this thing into me. I found out later on after I figured everything out. So I was sent to this hospital in Florence, South Carolina. And while I was in Florence, South Carolina, they had this huge barracks. You could tell it was a military facilities because You know, all the military facilities were like barracks, places where that house a whole lot of people at once, you know, and this was like a hospital, set up like a hospital. And everybody in this hospital were grown men. I was the only child in that whole barracks. And when I arrived there, immediately they took me, fumigated my body, you know, put me in the shower, sprayed me with some disinfectant, that same kind of stuff that they do to prisoners when they go to jail. Sprayed me with this disinfectant, got me washed up, put me in my gown that we wore. Everybody wore a gown, you understand? And no underwear, no underclothes, just a gown, a long frock that they put me in. I had a bunk bed that I slept in, and everybody had a bunk bed, and everybody was like, you know, a certain distance apart in their bunks. And immediately they started shooting this penicillin into you every 2 hours in the day and every 2 hours in the night. They shot it in your buttocks, you know, every 2 hours, day and night. They shot this penicillin into me. On about the 5th day, they came to me and said, "We have to give you a spinal tap." Now, I'm 9 years old. I don't know what a spinal tap is. But they said to me, "When we push this needle into you, you must not move. You must be perfectly still. And when we remove this needle, you must lie on your back perfectly still for the next 2 days. You're not to move." I'll tell you, man, try lying on your back, stretched out, and not moving for 2 days, and you will know the misery that put on the human body. And I was a 9-year-old undergoing the same thing as these grown people was undergoing. So I bent over, had to bend over like this, because they wanted that vertebrae to open up, and they pushed that needle through that vertebrae into my spinal cord and collected some tissue. And this tissue was supposed to be taken to the lab so that they can determine how syphilis affects the nervous system and whether or not the penicillin, you understand, once it gets into your spinal tissue, how it affects the syphilis bug. So for the next 2 days after they gave me that, man, I'll tell you, if you make a slight move, it's a pain. I can't even describe that pain. Because that little bit of tissue that they took from the spine, it took about 3 or 4 days for that little bit of tissue to grow back. And until that grows back, you're going to suffer some degree of excruciating pain. I can't even describe this pain. But I laid there like a mummy for 2 days. And at the end of 2 days, that bad feeling had gone away. And they started back giving me my shots every 2 hours in a day, every 2 hours in the night. And for the next 5 days, matter of fact, It was in February. I spent my birthday. I was 9 years old, and my 10th birthday was on February 24th. I was in that hospital, and at the end of those 10 days, miraculously, all the whelps on my leg was gone, and I was declared free of syphilis. That means that their experiment had worked. When I look back at it today, I realized that what they did to me, taking me away from my family, was wrong. But the fact that this penicillin that they created worked, the experimentation on me worked, I saved thousands and thousands and thousands of white people because they were the ones that had the most syphilis. They were the ones that had brought syphilis to America from Europe. You understand? And penicillin became it is even to this day. They call it duracillin. They got all kind of different names for it now. But for any kind of infection, even when you go to the dentist, that's what they give you now. Penicillin. Some form of penicillin. They have improved on it over the years. But I get a large degree of gratification from the fact that the experiments they did on me saved the lives of a lot of people. And not once did the government ever contacted my parents to make amends for lying to her and offer any kind of compensation for what they had done to me. To this day, I feel I'm due some kind of compensation from the government for undergoing this experimentation and for all the lives was saved because of it. They had to know how it worked on adults and how it worked on children. And for children, it worked, and I believe that I was the only child guinea pig that was used in the experimentation of penicillin for encephalitis. True story. 9-year-old kid, South Carolina. And in those days, they were prejudiced. You understand? Black people was being lynched. They hated black people and Jews. They had signs up. Niggers, Jews, and dogs not allowed. I'll never forget those signs. You know what I'm saying? White only. Toilets, white only. Restaurants. If you're a black person, you want to eat something, they had a little window around the back. You go around the back, and they'll serve you something through the window. Of course, we didn't eat in the restaurants in those days. We ate at home because we figured if they felt that way about us, they were spitting in the food, whatever they gave you, because they hated us. But things ain't like they used to be. It's a little different now. Things ain't what they used to be. Ba 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 ba. So I'm happy to be here. And I'm happy to let the world know what happened to me, a 9-year-old, at a time when America was not so great. This is DR Big Black, Yamon Dada, coming to you. my podcasts. Do this to get to that. If you want to get to that, sometimes you got to do this. See you next time.